By the time Clara Vance reached the mouth of the narrow passage, the Arizona sun had burned the color out of everything except the rock. The sky was a hard sheet of blue. The cliffs rose red on either side of the trail, and the dust under Cinder's hooves was so fine it climbed into the seams of her boots and settled behind her teeth. 3 riders waited where the canyon pinched down to a single wagon track. Clara saw the rifles first. Then the horses, tall, expensive animals with clean tack and silver on the bridles. Men who rode horses like that expected the road to open when they arrived. The one in the dark vest did not bother to hide his appraisal. Preston Thorne sat straight in his saddle despite the heat, one gloved hand resting near his polished holster. He had the careful face of a man who had learned to smile while taking something away from you. Beside him, Silas Grissom leaned forward and spat into the dirt near Cinder's front hoof. Roads closed. Clara looked past him. 2 fresh wagon ruts cut deep into the trail. The outer edges were crushed wider than ordinary freight wheels, and the stone between them had been shaved by repeated heavy loads. Timber, iron, something dense enough to make the dry ground remember it. Grissom watched her eyes move and laughed. You lose your family somewhere? No. Then you're lost on your own. Clara swung one leg over Cinder and dropped to the ground. She was short enough that most men mistook her size for youth at first glance. She had learned not to correct them quickly. People said useful things when they believed the person listening did not matter. She crouched beside the ruts. Thorne's smile thinned. What are you doing? Clara pressed 2 fingers into a place where a wheel had bitten through the top crust and exposed darker soil beneath. She measured the width with her hand, then looked toward a faint scrape on the canyon wall where a wagon hub had struck stone. Those wagons were loaded too high for cattle feed, she said. Grissom stopped smiling. Clara stood and brushed dust from her skirt, and too heavy for empty water barrels. Thorne studied her more carefully. The change was small, but Clara noticed it. She noticed most things men assumed women missed. Who are you? He asked. Someone trying to get through. You're trying to reach Ironstock's place. Clara did not answer. Grissom shifted in his saddle. You hear me, girl? Turn around. That ranch is no place for something your size. The gate latch probably weighs more than you do. One of the other riders laughed. Clara looked at the trail again. The direct road was blocked by 3 men and 4 horses. The ridge on the east side of the canyon was ugly, loose shale, narrow footing, a steep run above a wash, but not impossible. Not for Cinder. She put one boot into the stirrup. Thorne's voice sharpened. I told you the road is closed. Clara settled into the saddle. That road is. She turned Cinder toward the ridge. For half a second, nobody moved. Then Grissom cursed and wheeled his horse after her. The climb began with hard stone and became worse 50 yards up. Cinder was a small mountain pony with a thick neck, scarred knees, and the useful habit of distrusting ground that looked easy. Clara leaned forward and gave him his head. Behind them came the pounding of larger horses. Grissom's men expected speed to solve the problem. Clara expected weight to create one. She guided Cinder toward a gray tongue of shale that spilled down the slope like broken crockery. The pony shortened his stride. Clara counted under her breath. 1, 2, set. Cinder stepped onto a flat stone near the edge. 1, 2, set. The loose rock shifted, but only a little. A horse behind them struck the center of the slide at a gallop. Clara heard iron shoes scrabble, then a shout. The animal's hindquarters swung sideways. Its rider hauled back hard enough to make the bit ring against teeth. Clara did not look around until she reached a shelf no wider than a kitchen table. Below, Grissom had stopped at the base of the shale. His face was red with heat and anger. One of his riders had dismounted to inspect a horse's foreleg. Clara lifted 2 fingers to the brim of her hat. Grissom shouted something she could not hear over the wind. Cinder picked his way higher. The air cooled near the crest. Cedar replaced creosote. The land opened suddenly, and Clara saw the basin for the first time. Stone walls crossed the valley in low gray lines. Irrigation channels flashed silver where the sun struck them. A ranch house sat against the base of a dark cliff, built from stacked rock and heavy cedar so that it looked less constructed than discovered. The great gates at the lower end of the basin were open. Their timbers were banded in iron, bleached nearly white by years of weather. Clara let Cinder breathe. She had come because she had heard Nisha Irontock hired people for what they could do, not what they looked like doing it. She had not trusted the rumor. Rumors about fair men usually came from people who had never needed fairness badly enough to test it. Still, she had ridden 3 days to find out. The ranch yard went quiet when she entered. A dog sleeping beneath a wagon raised its head. Chickens scratched around a split barrel near the kitchen wall. Somewhere inside the corral, a horse kicked a board, and the smell of manure, sun-warmed leather, and boiling beans hung in the still afternoon. Two ranch hands were repairing a trace chain under a shade roof. They looked up together. One nudged the other. Clara ignored them. A man stepped out from the shadow of a basalt pillar. She had been told Nisha Irontock was big. The word had been inadequate. He stood well over 6 feet, broad through the shoulders, with long black and gray hair tied low at his back. His face was weathered, his forearms marked by old cuts and burns, and he carried himself with the quiet balance of someone who did not need to make noise to occupy space. He stopped 3 paces from Clara. The ranch hands behind her began to chuckle. "Boss," one called, "did the new cook come in a child's saddle?" Nisha did not look at him. He looked at Clara's boots, her saddle, the short-handled spade tied behind the cantle, the knife in its work sheath, the coil of thin hemp rope carefully wrapped against dust. Then he held out his hand. Clara waited. He turned his palm up. Understanding, she pulled off her gloves and placed both hands where he could see them. Her palms were thick with callus. A pale rope scar crossed the right hand below the thumb. 2 knuckles had flattened slightly after years of work. There was old pitch in one fingernail she had never managed to scrub completely out. Nisha touched the rope scar once. "Trace chain?" he asked. "Flooded wagon. You let go?" "No." His eyes lifted to hers. The ranch hands had stopped laughing. Nisha went to Cinder and inspected the spade. He tested the edge with his thumb, then looked at the leather wrapping on the handle where Clara had repaired a split. "You sharpen before travel. Easier than sharpening after something breaks." A corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. He pointed toward a line of stacked stone near the east orchard. "Can you lay drywall?" "Yes." "Can you clear a water vent?" "If I can fit." This time he did smile barely. "You can fit." The taller ranch hand muttered something under his breath. Nisha turned toward him. "A small wedge can hold a heavy door," he said. "A large stone in the wrong place can bring a wall down. Work long enough and you learn not to judge tools by size." He looked back at Clara. "You hungry?" She was. She nodded. That was how she was hired. Not with a contract, not with a speech, with beans, flatbread, and a place at the end of a scarred oak table. The first evening, Nisha did not ask where she had come from. Clara liked him for that. He showed her the bunk room, the wash basin, the nail where she could hang her coat. After supper, he took a piece of charcoal from the stove and drew a rough map in the dust on the table. "The basin looks dry," he said, "because the water stays where the sun cannot steal it." His charcoal line disappeared beneath a cup, reappeared near the salt bowl, and split into several smaller branches. "Acequias?" Clara asked. He nodded. She had seen open irrigation ditches in settlements farther east. Nisha's system was different. Some channels crossed the surface, but the important lines entered the mountain and traveled through cool, narrow passages supported by stone and cedar. Hidden vents controlled pressure. Overflow shafts diverted spring runoff. Covered runs reduced evaporation in the hottest months. "Who built them?" she asked. "My father repaired what his father learned from men before him. I changed some things. Water teaches you what you got wrong." His finger stopped at a line near the gate. "Thorn wants the deed to the water." Clara thought of the wagon ruts. "He's moving heavy equipment." Nisha's gaze lifted. "How heavy?" "More than feed. Maybe iron. Maybe powder later." He was silent for a moment. Then he wiped the map away with his forearm. "You notice tracks. I notice what people leave behind." Nisha looked at her as if that answer mattered. The next morning, Preston Thorne arrived at the cedar gates with 6 riders and an envelope the color of fresh cream. Clara was helping reset stones near the corral when the bell wire at the outer post rang once. Nisha wiped his hands on his trousers and walked down the passage. Clara followed at a distance. Thorne remained mounted. His men spread behind him in a shallow arc. Grissom was there, sunburned and sour. With a raw scrape along one cheek from the failed pursuit, Thorne held out the envelope. "Final notice," he said. "Your water claim is being reviewed. The Syndicate holds superior usage rights under filings recognized at the territorial seat. You can contest it, of course. That would require money, lawyers, time." Nisha did not take the paper. He looked over his shoulder at Clara. "Read." Thorne's arm remained extended. Clara stepped forward. For the first time since she had met him, Thorne looked uncertain about where to place his eyes. He had intended to negotiate with the giant. Instead, He was forced to lower his hand and give the document to the woman Grissom had called a doll. Clara broke the seal. The notice was dense with legal language and short on facts. She read slowly: dates, filing numbers, claims of non-use. A statement that the basin's diverted water had not been continuously beneficially employed. She looked toward the green strip of orchard visible beyond the gate. "No news?" she said. Thorne's jaw tightened. "You're not counsel." "No, I can still read." Grissom barked a laugh. "Careful little thing, paper cuts." Clara folded the notice and tucked it under her arm. Nisha said, "Done?" Thorne looked at him. "You have 10 days. Nisha closed the gate. The cedar met cedar with a deep final sound. That afternoon he took Clara underground. The entrance was hidden behind brush and a fitted wooden panel at the base of the cliff. When Nisha pulled it aside, cool air spilled out, carrying the smell of mineral water, wet wood, and old earth. Clara lit a small lantern. For the first 20 yards, Nisha could walk bent at the waist. Then the passage narrowed. His shoulders touched both walls. He stopped. "This is why you are here." The tunnel ahead was scarcely wide enough for Clara to crawl through with her elbows tucked close. He showed her the sound first. "Don't listen for water," he said. "Listen for what is wrong with it." She frowned. He rested a hand on the stone. "Steady flow has a steady voice." Clara pressed her palm to the wall. At first she heard nothing except the lantern flame and Nisha's breathing. Then she felt it. A low vibration, more sensation than sound, a pulse. Farther in, the pitch changed. Nisha pointed. Blockage. Clara removed her coat and tied the lantern to a short loop at her belt. She slid into the passage. The stone was cold against her cheek. Grit worked down the collar of her shirt. At one point, the ceiling dropped so low she had to exhale and flatten herself to move under a cedar brace. She found the problem 30 feet in, a cluster of river gravel and calcified silt packed behind a rusted lever. The work was slow. She loosened the crust with her knife, pulled out gravel one piece at a time, then worked the lever back and forth until it moved. Water surged through the opening with a smooth rush. The whole tunnel changed tone. When Clara crawled back out, gray mud covered her sleeves to the elbow. Nisha handed her a cloth and a water skin. "You heard it?" "Yes." "What?" She took a drink, then rested her hand on the wall again. Before, it sounded like somebody breathing through a bad chest. Now it doesn't. Nisha nodded. That was praise enough. Days settled into a rhythm. At dawn, Clara checked the lower vents while Nisha fed stock. By mid-morning, they repaired walls, cut cedar wedges, or cleared the surface ditches. The ranch hands who had laughed at her stopped laughing. After she showed one of them how to reset a binding, he had spent half a day trying to force into place. At meals, there was little talk. A tin pot of coffee stayed near the stove. Cornmeal cakes were stacked beneath a cloth. The kitchen smelled of smoke, chilies, and leather drying by the back door. Nisha taught Clara the knots used to bind the gateposts. The first time she saw him trying to pass a soaked strip of rawhide through a 4-inch gap between cedar and stone, she watched his thick fingers fail twice. "Move," she said. One eyebrow rose. "Please," he stepped aside. Clara slid her forearm into the gap, caught the end of the rawhide, and pulled it through. She looped it around the hidden peg and passed it back. Nisha tightened the binding. They repeated the process without speaking. By sunset, the post was firm. Clara flexed her fingers. The rawhide had burned a red line across her palm. Nisha held out a small tin of salve. She took it. "Thank you." He nodded toward the repaired gate. "Better than thanks." It took Clara a second to understand. The work was the thanks, she smiled. On the 5th day, Nisha sent Clara into town for lamp oil, salt, and a packet of steel rivets. It was the first time she had left the basin since arriving. The settlement sat 12 miles east along a broad, sun-whitened road. One side held a general store, a blacksmith, and a low building with territorial land office, painted across a board that had warped in the heat. On the other side were a saloon, a livery, and 3 houses with laundry snapping on lines behind them. Clara tied Cinder outside the store. Conversation changed when she entered. Not stopped, changed. Men learned to soften a sentence half a second too late when the person being discussed appeared in the doorway. The clerk, Mr. Vale, looked over her shoulder. "You alone?" "Yes." "From Ironstock's place?" "Yes." He hesitated before reaching for the salt sack, thought he'd send one of the hands. He did. Vale looked at her, then decided not to argue. While he filled the order, 2 cattlemen near the stove discussed Thorne's Syndicate. One said the company had purchased 3 small outfits south of the rail spur. The other said purchased was a generous word for what happened after the owner's wells failed. Clara listened while examining a box of rivets. Those are too large, Vale said. For what? He opened his mouth, then closed it. Clara chose the smaller size. At the counter, she saw a printed notice pinned beside the mail slots. It announced a hearing on contested water claims and listed Preston Thorne's company as petitioner in several cases. Not just Naichi's. Can I borrow a pencil? She asked. Vale handed one over. Clara copied the filing numbers onto the back of the supply list. The clerk watched. You planning to become a lawyer? No. Then what do you want with those? To know whether a man who says his claim is unique has said the same thing to everybody else. Vale scratched his jaw. You didn't hear it from me. But Thorne has friends in that land office. Clara glanced toward the warped sign across the street. What kind of friends? The kind who drink from his bottle. That was not evidence, but it was direction. She paid and carried the supplies outside. At the hitch rail, Ezra Miller was loading flour into his wagon. He was a broad, raw-boned rancher with a gray mustache and the permanent squint of a man who spent more time outdoors than under a roof. He looked at Clara's salt sack. Irontock sending children for freight now? Clara put the sack across Cinder's pack frame. Seems so, Miller chuckled. Need a stool to tie that down? No. Do you need help remembering why your east pasture floods every monsoon? His smile faded. Clara had ridden past his place on the way in. His drainage ditch cut straight down the grade, fast enough to carve itself deeper with every storm. Miller stared at her. What do you know about my pasture? Enough not to build a ditch like that. She mounted Cinder. Behind her, the store clerk laughed before he could stop himself. Clara rode out without looking back. The encounter bothered her less than the filing notice. Back at the ranch, she spread the copied numbers on the table. Nisha read them in silence. 3 ranches? He said. 4, counting yours. He pointed to one name. Roja's lost his north well last year. Did the Syndicate buy him out? Nisha nodded. This one? Widow named Belle. Sold after her cattle started dying. Clara sat down. Water? Maybe. Or somebody made sure she had less of it. Nisha studied the paper. You think Thorne was doing this before he came here? I think men who discover an easy trick usually use it more than once. They began keeping records that night. Not because paper was more important than water, but because Thorne understood paper, and they intended to deny him any place to hide inside it. Clara found an old ledger in a chest near the office wall. Nisha's father had recorded calf births, grain sales, rain dates, repairs, and the cleaning of irrigation lines in a mix of English, Apache words Clara did not know, and small symbols marking seasons. Why is there a circle beside these dates? She asked. Full moon, easier to clean the open channels at night in summer. And these marks? Cottonwood leaf, spring runoff. The book covered nearly 20 years. Clara ran one finger down the entries. Every season contained evidence of use. Every year contradicted Thorne's claim that the water had been abandoned. Keep this dry, she said. Nisha looked offended. It has stayed dry longer than you have been alive. Then continue doing excellent work. He gave her the slow look that meant she had tested the limits of his patience and survived. They wrapped the ledger in oilcloth anyway. The new record-keeping changed small things around the ranch. At the end of each workday, Clara noted which vents they cleared and which gates they adjusted. Ranch hands who had once considered writing beneath them now learned to report dates, because Clara would track them down after supper if they forgot. What day did you patch the north trough? She asked one evening. A hand named Eli stared into his beans. Tuesday. Which Tuesday? The Tuesday after Miller's red heifer got loose. That is not a date. It is to Miller. Nisha coughed into his cup. Clara narrowed her eyes at him. Do not encourage them. By the end of the week, even Eli had begun scratching dates on a scrap nailed beside the tool shed. It was unglamorous work. That was why Clara trusted it. Threats were dramatic. Records were dull. Dull things survived courtrooms. The same week, she earned the respect of the 2 men who had laughed when she arrived. A young steer broke through a corral panel at dusk and caught a length of loose wire around one hind leg. Every time a hand approached, the animal kicked harder, tightening the wire and cutting deeper into the hair above the hoof. The men tried to rope him from outside. The steer crashed into the boards. Nisha was on the far side of the basin, repairing a diversion gate. Clara watched the animal's eyes, then looked beneath the lower rail. There was a space barely large enough for her shoulders. Hold his head left, she told Eli. You're not going in there. Yes. He'll kick you into next week. Then hold his head left. She lay flat and slid under the bottom rail. The dirt smelled of manure and trampled hay. The steer's rear hoof struck the ground inches from her hand. Clara waited until the animal shifted weight, then moved close to the leg rather than away from it. There was less force near the body than at the end of the kick. She cut the wire with her short knife. The steer jerked once. The wire fell free. Clara rolled beneath the rail and came up with dust across her face. Eli stared at her. "You're crazy, probably." The other hand, Joseph handed her hat back. "No," he said. "She's short." For one terrible second, Clara thought they were beginning again. Then Joseph grinned. "Turns out that's useful." Clara took the hat. "That took you long enough." After that, when someone new made a remark about her size, Eli usually answered before she had to. It did not make the basin gentle. It made it familiar. And familiarity, Clara discovered, was one of the first shapes belonging could take. The Syndicate kept watching. One afternoon, Clara saw a flash on the north ridge while she was checking a surface vent. It came twice too regular to be quartz. A telescope. She ducked behind a saltsadar. Through the heat haze, she saw a thin man lying near the crest, Josiah Blackwood. She remembered him from the passage, one of Thorne's quiet scouts. Clara reached beside the vent and found a green shard from an old bottle. She angled it into the sun. The reflected light struck the ridge. Blackwood jerked away from his glass. Clara moved while he was blinded, crossing 50 yards of open ground through scrub no horse could enter. By the time he looked again, the vent appeared unattended. That evening, she told Nisha. "He's mapping the ridge," she said. "Let him." Clara looked up. Nisha was shaving a cedar peg with his knife. "Let him, he wants weakness." The knife pared off one long curl. "We can give him one." At midnight, they went to the western wall. Nisha loosened a fitted stone near an old drainage run. From outside, it looked as if the foundation had cracked. Behind it, however, the apparent gap opened into a dead chamber connected to an overflow shaft. Clara crouched inside and examined the channel. "If someone enters here and we open the high sluice, water fills it. How fast?" "Fast enough." They reset the decoy so it looked newly disturbed. 2 nights later, Blackwood came. Nisha watched him from the shadows while Clara lay behind a vent grate farther inside. Blackwood ran his hands over the wall, found the loose stone, and nearly shook with relief. He marked the spot with a small scratch near the ground. Nisha let him leave. "He'll tell Thorne," Clara whispered. "That is why we showed him." The next attack came before they were ready for it. Clara was kneeling by the eastern channel at noon, one palm against basalt, when the steady hum of water changed. A thin whistle ran through the stone. She froze. Then came a hollow rattle. "Breach." She was on her feet before the word finished, leaving her mouth. She moved through low brush toward the boundary line and found Grissom with 2 men working iron bars into the outer masonry. Water had begun to leak into the dirt. Grissom swung a sledge. Stone cracked. Clara did not confront them. 3 armed men in open ground was not a problem that courage solved. Instead, she crawled into a maintenance cut hidden beneath brush and reached the inner side of the damaged vent. Cold water struck her knees. A support had shifted. A flat basalt slab that should have held against the pressure was sliding. Clara braced it with both hands. The current pushed back. Her boots lost purchase. She needed a tie. Her tool roll was outside the narrow section. She felt the ribbon at the back of her neck. Blue silk, faded and frayed. Her mother had tied it around a packet of letters years ago. Clara had kept it because it weighed almost nothing. She pulled it free. The stone slipped another inch. Clara threaded the ribbon through an iron brace, wrapped it twice around the edge of the slab, then cinched it with a knot meant for wet rope. Silk was not made for masonry, but the weave held long enough for her to wedge 2 smaller stones beneath the slab and pack silt around the gap. The whistle lowered, then stopped. Outside, voices rose. Nisha had reached the road. Clara could not see him, but she knew what he was doing, standing in the open, making Thorne and Grissom look at the largest threat while she repaired the smallest failure. By the time she crawled out, soaked to the waist, and with her hair loose down her back, the Syndicate riders were withdrawing. Nisha waited near the intake pool. His eyes went to her hair. The ribbon? In the wall. He looked at the restored flow. Good place for it. They walked back toward the corrals. Near the winter grain bin, Clara smelled something sweet. Not sugar, not healthy feed. A thick molasses odor with a bitter edge beneath it. She stopped. A handful of oats lay scattered just inside the fence. Nisha reached down. "Don't." Clara caught his wrist. He looked at her hand, then at the oats. She bent close without touching them. "Poison. You know which? Strychnine, maybe. Smell is covered, but not enough." Naichi's face changed in a way Clara had learned to recognize. Anger in him did not become movement, it became stillness. They spent an hour searching the fence line and found 3 more small piles. That night they burned the contaminated grain in a pit downwind from the animals. No one spoke while it burned. The smoke smelled wrong. The attack on the passage came 3 nights later. Grissom led 6 riders toward the gate under a thin moon. Clara waited in a crack above the trail with both hands on a cedar lever. For 2 days she and Nisha had worked loose stone into a controlled slide. Not enough to bury men or horses, enough to erase the road. A white quartz marker gleamed below. Clara counted riders. 1, 2. Grissom passed the marker. She leaned all her weight onto the lever. For a moment nothing happened. Then the wooden catch broke free. Shale began to move. The sound started soft, like dry grain pouring into a bin. It grew until the canyon wall seemed to exhale. Grissom's horse reared. Boulders struck the trail ahead and bounced once before settling. Smaller stone poured around them, building a waist-high barrier across the passage. The riders stopped in a cloud of pale dust. Nisha stood on the ridge above. He had a bow in his hand. The first arrow hit the dirt near Grissom's horse. The second struck a few feet to the left. The third completed a rough arc. No one was hit. The meaning was clear anyway. Grissom fired blindly toward the ridge. The muzzle flash made his own face visible. Nisha's next arrow broke the lantern hanging from Grissom's saddle. Darkness dropped over the riders. They retreated through the dust, stumbling around each other and cursing the mountain. Clara remained in the crevice until the last hoofbeat faded. When she climbed down, Nisha was already inspecting the slide. She sat on a cold boulder and wiped grit from her eyes. "Think they learned?" she asked. "No," she laughed once, tired. "No, I suppose not." Nisha crouched beside her. His eyes settled on a scrape along her wrist where the lever had kicked back. He opened the same tin of salve he had given her before. Clara held out her hand without argument. Down in the Syndicate camp, the failure at the passage did more than embarrass Thorn. It frightened him. He hid that fact from his men. He hid it from Grissom. He could not hide it from the telegram folded inside his coat. The message had arrived 2 days earlier from the company office in New York. It contained no concern for terrain, local law, or the men already injured trying to force the basin. It asked one question: when would the water asset be secured? A second line reminded him that further capital depended on timely consolidation of the territory's smaller ranches. Thorn read the telegram beside a low campfire while Grissom drank rye from a tin cup. The paper shook once in the wind. Thorn folded it along the original creases. Grissom watched him. "They're getting nervous back east? They are getting impatient. Same thing in better boots." Thorn put the telegram away. He had not begun as a man who hired poisoners and saboteurs. That was the story he told himself. He had begun as a clerk in a railroad office, copying numbers for men who owned the trains. He had watched fortunes change hands because one signature arrived before another. He had learned that land was rarely taken by the strongest person standing on it. It was taken by whoever defined its value on paper first. When the cattle syndicate offered him a position consolidating water claims, he considered it advancement, not theft. Most small ranchers were indebted. Many filings were incomplete. Boundaries were vague. Wells failed. Men sold. Thorn simply learned how to stand at the moment of failure with a contract ready. Then success changed the standard. The company began expecting failures on schedule. If a rancher did not become desperate quickly enough, a fence might be cut. If water remained reliable, a ditch might mysteriously clog. If livestock stayed healthy, feed could be contaminated. Thorn had crossed each line separately, which made it easier to pretend there had never been a line at all. The basin was supposed to be another transaction. Instead, it had become a public measure of his competence. That was what he could not forgive. Not Nisha's refusal, not Clara's interference, humiliation. He looked toward the dark ridge. "They made the men afraid of the mountain," he said. Grissom drank. "Men get afraid when arrows land close. They need to be afraid of me more." Grissom lowered the cup. There it was. The part of Thorn usually wrapped in legal language. "What do you want?" he asked. "The powder wagons from the railhead." Grissom's face changed. "In that passage?" "Yes. Too much vibration could bring half the wall down. Then we use less. You know how much?" Thorn looked at him. Grissom laughed without humor. "Right. For all his brutality." Grissom understood physical danger better than Thorn did. A man who had been thrown from horses, crushed beneath cattle, and cut in bar fights developed respect for forces bigger than himself. Thorne respected only consequences that appeared in ledgers. "Bring the wagons," he said. Grissom stood. "If this goes wrong, there won't be a clean story after." Thorne's voice stayed soft. "Then make sure it does not go wrong." Josiah Blackwood heard the exchange from behind the supply tent. He had come to report the false weakness at the western wall. For several seconds he remained still with one hand on the canvas flap. He had known about the poisoned grain. He had helped mark the water lines. He had told himself no one would die if Nisha surrendered soon enough. Powder changed the lie. Blackwood stepped into the firelight. Thorne looked at him. "Well, I found a gap in the west wall." Grissom smiled. Thorne did not. "Can men pass? One at a time. Can powder pass?" Blackwood thought of the dark hole behind the loose stone. Yes, the answer left a bad taste in his mouth. Thorne nodded. "Good, then we have 2 doors." Blackwood returned to his bedroll and did not sleep. Across the basin, Clara woke before dawn with the uneasy sense that something had changed. She could not have explained why. The water sounded normal. The gates were still. No riders showed on the ridge. But when she stepped outside, she found Nisha already awake, staring toward the passage. "You feel it too?" she asked. He nodded. "What?" Nisha's eyes stayed on the horizon. "A man who has lost with patience will try anger next." Clara wrapped her coat tighter. "Then we should be ready for anger." They were. The next morning the ground began to tremble. Clara was inside the ranch house, repairing a leather strap at the table, when she felt a faint vibration through the chair legs. She put the strap down. Another vibration, long, slow, rhythmic. She slid from the chair and placed her palm flat on the flagstone floor. Nisha came in from the yard and saw her there. "What? Wagons? How many?" She closed her eyes. The tremor arrived in pulses separated by the uneven cadence of heavy teams. "More than 4, she waited, and heavy." Nisha's face became unreadable. "Powder." Clara opened her eyes. He did not need to explain. Thorne had run out of documents, threats, poison, and patience. By sunset, the western sky had turned purple around the peaks. A storm was building somewhere beyond the rim, and the air smelled faintly of ozone. Nisha stood at the cedar gates with one hand on the weathered wood. "There is a horse ready in the back corral," he said. Clara stared toward the passage. "The north trail will stay open another hour, maybe 2. She looked at him. "You want me to leave? I want you alive. I can be both here and alive. This is different. So am I." Nisha exhaled through his nose. Clara stepped closer to the gate. "I have left every place that decided I was a burden before I could prove otherwise. My father said I was too small for the plow. My brother said I was too slow carrying sacks. Men in town hired me until they saw me, then found some reason the position had been filled. I am tired of making other people comfortable by disappearing." She pressed her palm against the cedar. "You gave me work that mattered. You taught me the veins of this place. If they come for the basin, they come for my work too." Nisha was quiet. Clara looked up at him. "You can hold the gate. I can go where you can't. We've known that from the first day." A gust moved through the passage and carried the smell of distant horses. Nisha nodded once. "All right." That was the closest he came to surrender. They prepared until dark. Clara stripped off her coat at the hidden acequia entrance and tied cedar wedges, a short mallet and a length of cord to her belt. Nisha checked the rope around her waist. "This one stays on," he said. "I know. You cut it only if the mountain is pulling me in with you. That seems unfair to the mountain." Nisha stared at her. Clara smiled. A breath of laughter escaped him. It was the first time she had heard the sound. Then she crawled into the dark. The tunnel swallowed the wind. Cold water covered her hands. The ceiling pressed low enough that her shoulder blades brushed stone. She moved by memory, counting turns and feeling the carved marks Nisha had made near each junction. At the secondary sluice, she wedged herself on one hip and worked the old iron ring loose. Above ground, the first wagon hit the lower barrier. The vibration ran through the rock and into her bones. Clara struck the ring with her mallet, once. Twice, the metal broke free. Water rushed into the bypass chamber. Outside, Nisha had placed the great cedar gate bar low across 2 braces. When Grissom drove the lead wagon toward the entrance, Nisha did not try to stop several tons of moving wood by strength alone. He angled the bar. The wagon's front axle struck it off-center. One wheel climbed the timber. The other sank into the drainage cut. The wagon tipped hard, throwing Grissom sideways into the dust. At the same moment, Clara opened the first vent. A sheet of cold runoff burst from stone slots above the trail and hit the second team broadside. Horses screamed and backed away. Men jumped clear. Powder crates slammed together inside the wagon. The attack did not end, but the passage bought them time. By dawn, Thorn withdrew his men to the lower flats. Clara crawled out with bleeding elbows and mud in her hair. Nisha was sitting against the gatepost, repairing a split leather strap as if the night had been ordinary. He handed her a cup of coffee. The coffee was terrible. She drank all of it. They slept for 2 hours. At mid-morning, the water stopped. Not slowed, stopped. Clara woke to silence. She sat up on the bunk. The basin always carried small noises, the trough spilling, the ditch murmuring beneath the kitchen wall, the faint movement into the stone vents. Now there was nothing. She ran outside barefoot. Nisha was already at the main channel. The ditch lay empty beneath the sun. A trout-sized fish from the holding pool thrashed in a shallow pocket. Clara scooped it up and carried it to a shaded barrel while Nisha walked the dry line toward the mountain. At the intake, broken stone and fresh pry marks told the story. The main run had been blocked from inside. Blackwood, Clara said. Maybe. Nisha looked into the dark opening. No ranch hand could fit past the first narrowing. Clara could. Nisha tied a rope around her waist. This time he pulled the knot himself until it hurt. Too tight, she said. Good. She looked at him. His face was calm, his hands were not. Clara touched his wrist. I'll tug twice if I need slack. 3 if you pull. 1 if you are caught. And what does 1 mean? That I pull anyway. She nodded. Nisha gave her a small oil-wrapped torch and a pry bar cut short enough for the tunnel. Clara went in. The first 100 feet were dry except for damp mud where water had recently flowed. The air smelled of wet limestone and old wood. She crawled past a joint she had repaired the week before and found it intact. Farther in, the tunnel floor dipped. Water pooled around her wrists. She heard breathing, not hers. Clara stopped. Who's there? A broken sound answered. She pushed around the bend. Josiah Blackwood lay against the far wall with a slab of limestone pinning one leg. His face was gray in the torchlight. Water reached his ribs. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Blackwood gave a small, miserable laugh. Of course it's you. Clara crawled closer. What happened? Stone came down. I can see that. I was setting the block. For Thorn? He closed his eyes. Yes. Water dripped from the ceiling. Clara looked at the slab. She could leave him. The thought came cleanly, without shame. Blackwood had mapped the ranch. He had carried Thorn's orders. He had helped poison feed and cut water. If she backed out now, the rising water would solve the problem. Blackwood seemed to read something in her face. I won't blame you, he whispered. That would be convenient, he coughed. Clara wedged the pry bar under the slab. Blackwood stared at her. What are you doing? Making a mistake, probably. The first attempt did nothing. She shifted the fulcrum, using a smaller stone near the base. You'll get trapped. Then stop talking and push when I tell you. I can't feel my foot. You don't need your foot. You need your hands. She drove the bar deeper. Above, the rope pulled gently at her waist, Nisha checking. Clara tugged twice for slack. She set both palms on the bar. Now, Blackwood pushed against the wall. Clara leaned. The iron bowed. The slab moved a fraction. Water rushed beneath it. Again changed angle, her boot slipped. The bar jumped and struck her shoulder. Pain flashed down her arm. Blackwood swore. Clara reset it. Again. This time the stone lifted enough for Blackwood to drag his knee free. A crack sounded above them. Both froze. The blockage was failing. Clara grabbed Blackwood's coat and pulled. He screamed when his leg moved. 3, Clara said aloud, then yanked the rope 3 times. Nisha pulled. The line snapped tight around her waist. Clara wrapped one arm around Blackwood and let the rope take their combined weight. The chamber broke behind them. Water hit like a kick door. The torch vanished. Darkness, cold, noise. Clara's shoulder slammed stone. Blackwood's weight dragged at her arm. She locked her hand in the rope and felt it burn through her wet palm. Then they moved. Not from the current, from Nisha. The giant pulled them through the narrowing one hard length at a time. Clara's knees scraped rock. Blackwood coughed and choked beside her. Water rose over their backs. Then suddenly the floor angled upward. Daylight appeared as a gray coin. Nisha's hands reached into the opening. He caught Clara by the forearm and hauled her out, then seized Blackwood by the coat and dragged him into the dry wash. The restored water roared beneath them. Clara lay on her back in the mud, coughing. Nisha crouched over her. His fingers checked her ribs, her shoulder, the back of her head. He did it without asking. I'm alive, she said. I can see. You look angry about it. His jaw tightened. Clara realized with surprise that he had been afraid. Not in the abstract way a rancher feared losing a worker, personally. She put a muddy hand over his wrist. I'm here. Nisha closed his eyes for a second. Then he turned toward Blackwood. The scout lay shaking under the sun. They carried him to the intake shed and wrapped him in 2 blankets. Clara splinted his leg with cedar strips. Nisha poured coffee into a tin cup and set it near him. Blackwood did not touch it. For a long time he stared at the floor. Finally he said, "Thorne's coming tonight." Nisha leaned against the wall. "How many?" 30, maybe more. He hired men out of Tucson, some from the mines. "Plan?" Clara asked. Blackwood looked at her, his face folded around shame. "He'll hit the gate with a ram, that's mostly noise." Grissom takes men up the west cut. They come through the weak place I marked, the false drain. Blackwood blinked. "You knew?" Nisha's expression did not change. Blackwood laughed once, bitterly. "God." He dragged one trembling finger through water on the floorboards and began drawing. "Riflemen here. 2 wagons with powder stay behind the first line. Thorne wants the gates broken before moonset. If the ram fails, they set charges at the lower hinge." Clara watched the map take shape. "How much powder?" "Enough to bring half the passage down if he's careless." "He is careless," Nisha said. Blackwood nodded. "Yes." He looked at Clara again. "I helped him cut your water." "I know. I put poison near the grain." "I know, I thought." He stopped. Clara waited. Blackwood rubbed both hands over his face. "I thought none of you mattered, not compared to what he was paying." The shed stayed quiet except for water moving outside. "What changed?" Clara asked. Blackwood looked at his splinted leg. "You crawled into a flooding hole to save me after you knew exactly who I was." Clara leaned back against the wall. "Don't mistake decency for forgiveness." "I won't." Nisha crouched beside the map. "Will you tell the marshal?" Blackwood swallowed. "Yes, tonight, if I can get a message out." Clara thought of the South rancher, Miller, who had refused Nisha credit the previous spring and laughed when Clara had first ridden through town. He lived 3 miles beyond the lower ridge. "Miller has a fast boy," she said. "Runs messages to the territorial road." Nisha nodded. Blackwood tore a page from the small notebook inside his coat. His hand shook as he wrote his name beneath a list of orders, locations, and men involved. He signed it twice. Nisha sent one of the younger hands by the North Trail with the note wrapped in oilcloth. The boy disappeared before sunset. Then the basin began to prepare for war. They worked first on the places most likely to fail. Nisha moved 2 stone blocks into the west drain chamber, leaving a narrow path that looked passable from outside. Clara adjusted the overflow gate so a single pull would divert water into the false entrance Blackwood had marked. The ranch hands stacked wet hides behind the lower cedar gates to slow fire. Barrels were filled and placed along the inner wall. Spare bridles, feed sacks, and tools were moved away from the gatehouse so a spark would find less to eat. No one talked about winning. They talked about rope lengths, water pressure, hinges, and where the horses should be moved if the lower corral caught fire. That made the fear manageable. Clara spent an hour in the kitchen cutting strips from an old flour sack and rolling them for bandages. The stove had gone cold. A pot of beans sat untouched on the back burner, a skin forming over the surface. One of the younger hands, Tomas, came in with 3 rifle cartridges held in his palm. Found these under the tack bench. Put them in the dry box. He did not move. Clara looked at him. He was 17, maybe 18, with dust in his hair and a face that still showed every thought before he could hide it. "You think they're coming all the way in?" he asked. "Yes." Tomas swallowed. "My mother says men with money always find another way. Sometimes, what if they don't?" Clara tied the last strip of cloth. "Then we make them regret choosing this one." He nodded, though he still looked frightened. Clara softened her voice. "Your job is the horses. If the front line breaks, you take the remuda up the North Trail. You do not come back for anyone unless Nisha tells you." "What about you?" "My job is under your feet." He glanced at the floor. That answer seemed to comfort him more than a promise would have. Outside, Nisha was checking the main gate bar. Clara joined him as the light left the canyon. The great cedar beam had survived 2 impacts but carried a split near one iron band. Nisha opened the crack with a wedge, while Clara poured hot pine resin inside. They drove a thin strip of hardwood into the split and wrapped the repair with rawhide. Their hands moved around each other without collision. Nisha held. Clara tied. He lifted. She aligned weeks before each task had required explanation. Now one motion began where the other ended. When the repair was finished, Nisha wiped resin from his thumb onto a rag. "Blackwood's note may not reach the marshal before morning. I know. The law may come after the law is useful. It often does." Nisha looked at her. "You learned that young." Clara sat on the lower gate brace. For a while she watched a moth batter itself against the lantern glass. "My father lost our farm when I was 16, she said. "Not all of it at once. First the Northfield, then the team, then the house." Nisha listened. "A lender in Prescott bought the note. My father kept saying the papers were wrong, that he had paid more than they credited. Maybe he had. Maybe he hadn't. It didn't matter. The men who came to collect had a sheriff with them. My father had a shovel. What happened? He put the shovel down." She rubbed resin from her finger. "After that he became angry at whatever was smaller than the men who took his land. Mostly me." Nisha's expression did not shift, but his eyes did. Clara continued before he could offer sympathy she did not want. "I learned paper can be used like a fence. I also learned a fence is only as honest as the person who set the posts." Nisha rested one hand on the cedar. "My father signed papers too." Clara waited. He could not read their language well. They told him the papers recognized grazing access. They recognized debt instead. The wind moved softly through the gate slats. "What did he do?" she asked. "Paid it. Then made sure I learned enough of their words to know when a man was hiding a knife in a sentence." Clara looked toward the dark passage where Thorn would come. "Maybe that's why he hates this place." "Who? Thorn? It doesn't behave like paper." Nisha's rare half-smile appeared. "No, stone is difficult to lie to. They ate standing up near midnight, flatbread, cold beans, dried apple slices. Coffee boiled so long it tasted burned." The men spoke quietly. Saddles creaked. Someone in the back corral hummed a hymn without words while brushing a mare. Clara checked the moon. It was high enough. The first signal came from the ridge. One covered lantern opened, closed, then opened again. Riders in the passage. Nisha set down his cup. Every person in the yard moved. The basin seemed to draw a breath. Clara went underground. She entered through the kitchen access this time, lifting a square cedar hatch beneath a flour bin. The narrow steps descended into cold air. She carried no lantern. The shafts were easier to navigate by touch than by light once the attack began, and a flame could betray a vent opening. At the first junction, she put her hand on the wall. The water hummed steadily. Above, a rifle cracked. Another answered. Then came the slow, heavy beat of the ram. Thud. The vibration shivered through the tunnel. Clara moved to the main pressure wheel. The wheel was iron, shoulder high to her, and stiff from years of mineral deposits. She had greased the spindle that afternoon. Now she tested it one notch. It moved. Good. At the west approach, 8 Syndicate men left their horses in a dry wash and climbed toward the false weak point. They carried 2 lanterns covered with dark cloth and a short crate of powder between them. Blackwood had drawn the route accurately. Nisha had improved it. The outer plug gave way after 3 blows. The first man crawled through. He found a narrow stone chamber with a second opening ahead. "Clear," he whispered. 2 more entered. The powder crate came next. Behind the wall, Tomas waited with his hand around a bell cord. When the 5th man entered, he pulled. A tiny brass bell rang once beneath Clara's hand underground. She shifted to the west lever. She did not release the full flow. That would have crushed men against stone. She opened a narrow bypass. Water came through the floor first, ankle deep and fast. The Syndicate men cursed. One lifted the powder crate. Then water sprayed from 2 side vents, hard enough to extinguish both lanterns and soak the crate through its seams. Darkness swallowed the chamber. The men backed toward the entrance. A fitted stone dropped behind them. Not enough to seal the room, only enough to make the exit low and difficult. Panic did the rest. They abandoned the powder and crawled out one at a time, wet, bruised, and furious. No one reached the courtyard. At the cedar gates, the real noise began. Thorn had brought a ram made from a trimmed pine trunk capped in iron and slung beneath a wagon frame. More than a dozen men pushed it forward on rollers. Grissom walked beside them, shouting cadence. Again. The iron head struck cedar. The gate jumped in its stone sockets. Nisha stood on the inner side with 4 ranch hands bracing the secondary beam. Splinters flew. A bullet passed through a gap and struck the wall behind him. Again, Grissom shouted. The ram rolled back. Nisha looked up toward the narrow slit where Clara's signal wire emerged. It moved once. West trap secure. He shifted his weight. Let them hit. One ranch hand stared at him. Boss, let them hit. The ram came forward. At the instant before impact, Nisha knocked the outer brace free. The left gate moved inward 6 inches. The ram struck at an angle. Its iron head skidded across cedar, tore through one outer plank, then slewed sideways. Men lost their footing. The rear roller jumped its track. The ram dropped. Grissom screamed at them to lift it. Thorn watched from horseback near the rear line. He had expected resistance. He had not expected the ranch to respond like a machine. "Powder!" he shouted. Two men ran toward the lower hinge carrying a black crate. Inside the tunnel, Clara heard the change before the bell wire moved. Heavy footsteps near the hinge transmitted a different rhythm through the foundation. She crawled to the lower control and pressed her ear to stone. Metal scraped outside. A hammer tap, then another. They were setting charges. Clara opened the cooling vent. Water burst from a slot no wider than her hand just above the hinge. It hit the powder men across the shoulders and poured directly into the shallow hole they had dug for the charge. One man dropped the crate. The other slipped, cursed, and scrambled backward. Grissom ran toward them. "What are you doing?" "Water's coming out of the damn wall." "Then stop it." "With what?" Grissom kicked the soaked crate hard enough to split one corner. Black powder spilled into mud. For the first time that night, fear entered Thorne's face. Not fear of death, fear of expense. Every minute of the attack was consuming men, horses, equipment, and reputation. He dismounted and strode toward the gate. "Burn it." A torch landed against the lower cedar, then another, oil caught. Flame climbed the dry outer face of the gate. Inside, Nisha and the ranch hands threw wet hides over the hottest section. Steam hissed. Smoke rolled through the cracks. Clara smelled it underground. Burning cedar had a sweet, bitter odor she would remember long after the siege. She opened the small roof vents to draw smoke away from the lower chambers. Above her, the gate shook again. The attack continued for nearly an hour. Thorne's men fired at shadows on the walls. Nietzsche's people answered only when a clear target threatened the gatehouse or horses. Ammunition was limited. Stone was not. Clara moved from control to control, opening water where fire appeared, closing it before pressure dropped elsewhere. She kept a count in her head. North Reserve half. West overflow quarter. Main line steady. The work left no room for fear until the bell at the inner courtyard rang twice. Not a planned signal. Clara froze. She heard boots above. Heavy boots. Someone had entered the ranch. Silas Grissom had found another way. While Thorne pushed the front attack, Grissom had taken 3 men up a narrow livestock shelf along the south wall. One fell and broke an ankle. Another turned back. Grissom and the third reached an old hay gate, used only during winter storms. The ranch hand guarding it fired once and missed. Grissom hit him with the barrel of his revolver and forced the gate. He entered the inner yard alone after his companion stopped to bind a wounded arm. Smoke drifted low between the buildings. Grissom saw the kitchen door standing open. He also saw Clara. She had come up through the floor hatch to check the main gate from above. Her hair was tied back with a strip of flour sack. Mud streaked one cheek. In one hand she held an iron wrench. For a second both stared at each other. Then Grissom smiled. "Well," Clara stepped backward. "All this trouble," he said, "and I finally find the little rat." She ran, not toward the gate, toward the stone corridors behind the house. Grissom followed. He was faster on open ground, but the basin offered less of it with every turn. Clara passed between 2 storage walls barely 3 feet apart. Grissom struck one shoulder against stone and swore. She cut left at the smokehouse, climbed 3 shallow steps, and slipped behind a cedar screen. Grissom saw the movement. He fired. The bullet buried itself in a roof beam. Clara did not fire back. She wanted him angry. Angry men stopped measuring. She crossed a narrow bridge over an open acequia and entered the old inner works where Nisha's father had built maintenance passages between stacked walls. Grissom followed, breathing hard. "You think you can hide in holes forever?" Clara turned a corner. "No." Her voice carried back strangely through the stone. "I only need one." Grissom rounded the corner and caught sight of her skirt disappearing into a vertical slit between 2 walls. He lunged. The opening was just under a foot wide. Clara turned sideways and passed through. Grissom shoved an arm in after her. His shoulder jammed. He forced harder. Stone scraped his coat, his chest compressed. He managed to wedge half his torso into the gap, then stopped. Clara stood on the other side, close enough to see sweat running down his face. Grissom reached for her. His fingers stopped 6 inches short. "Come here." Clara looked at his trapped shoulder. "No." He pushed. The wall did not move. Men like Grissom believed force became authority if applied long enough. The stone had no opinion on the matter. Clara rested her palm against the inner wall. She felt the faint vibration of the front gate under attack. Grissom saw the gesture. "What are you doing?" "Listening." "To what?" "The part you never learned." She walked away. He roared after her. The corridor narrowed farther, then opened beside a recessed iron handle. Clara pulled it. A weighted slab shifted down behind Grissom with a deep grinding sound. He ripped himself free from the crack just before the stone sealed it, stumbling backward into the outer corridor. He was not crushed. He was trapped in a dry maintenance cell with one grated opening no wider than a plate. His fist struck stone. "Vance!" Clara approached the grate. His face appeared in shadow. "You think this makes you big?" he hissed. Clara leaned her forehead against the cool wall. "No." She was surprised by how calm she felt. "I think it makes you contained. You open this door, no. When Thorn gets through that gate. When he gets through, I will make sure." Clara stepped back. "Save your breath, the room gets cold." She left him there. Outside, the siege had reached its ugliest stage. Thorn had lost the ram, most of his powder, and the West team. He still had men. He sent them forward in 2 lines. Rifle fire cracked against the gatehouse. Nisha had taken a graze along his upper arm. Blood darkened one sleeve, but the wound was shallow. He tied a cloth around it and kept moving. When the lower gate finally splintered near the damaged plank, Thorn shouted in triumph. A section the width of a man's shoulders opened. One Syndicate rider tried to force his horse through. Nisha stepped into the gap. The animal stopped. Not because Nisha struck it, because he put one hand on the bridle and turned its head aside. The rider raised a revolver. Nisha seized his wrist, pulled him from the saddle, and lowered him to the ground hard enough to end the argument. Another man entered behind him. A ranch hand knocked the rifle from his grip with a shovel. The gap became chaos. Thorn fired from outside. A bullet struck the stone near Nisha's head. Nisha looked through the broken cedar and found him. Something in Thorn's posture changed. He stepped backward. Nisha stepped through the gate. The men outside faltered. He was not carrying a rifle now. Only the heavy ranching spade, its steel blade scarred by stonework. "Move," Thorn ordered his men. No one moved quickly enough. Nisha reached the lead supply wagon. He did not attack a man. He attacked the machine. He drove the spade beneath the wagon's side rail and levered upward. The old wood cracked. He tore a loose board free, reached down and pulled the axle pin from the front wheel while 2 Syndicate men stared in disbelief. The wheel tilted. Nisha kicked the hub. It came off. The wagon dropped onto one corner with a crash, spilling crates, blankets, ammunition boxes, and 2 expensive leather cases into the mud. Thorn shouted for someone to shoot him. A few raised rifles. Then the mountain began to hum. Every horse heard it before every man. Heads lifted. Ears went forward. The ground vibrated. Clara was back below the kitchen floor with both hands on the master lever. The final defense was dangerous. Nisha had explained it carefully. The high reservoir could release enough water through the lower vents to flood the passage. But if she opened too quickly, pressure might crack the oldest section of a sequoia near the orchard. Too slowly, and the water would merely make mud around the attacker's boots. She had to feel the system as it changed. Clara closed her eyes. The main line sang against her palms. She turned the wheel 1 quarter. Pressure rose, another quarter. The cedar braces groaned. She waited. Above, Nisha saw water bead along the base of the outer wall. He moved uphill. The ranch hands followed. Thorn noticed. "Hold your ground," he shouted. The first vent opened. Cold water exploded from the cliff 20 yards above the trail and struck the road in a white arc. Men scattered. The second vent opened lower down. Water crossed the passage from both sides. The dust became slurry. Horses backed and slid. Thorn's remaining powder wagon sank to the axle. He tried to climb onto the wheel. Clara turned the lever another notch. The main overflow released. The sound was enormous. Not an explosion. A sustained roar, deeper than gunfire, as mountain runoff rushed through the hidden stone arteries and returned to open air. A waist-high sheet of water entered the lower passage. It hit the disabled wagons first. The one Nisha had dismantled swung sideways and wedged across the trail, becoming a barrier that split the current. Water rose behind it and spilled around both ends. Men abandoned weapons to keep their footing. A crate floated away, struck a rock, and opened. Shirts, paper packets, and tins spun downstream. Thorn climbed onto a boulder. His fine boots disappeared beneath muddy water. "Stop this!" he shouted toward the gate. No one answered. The basin was not negotiating anymore. The current was strong enough to destroy equipment, but not deep enough to drown a standing man on the higher side of the passage. That had been Clara's calculation. She wanted them out, not buried. The lower camp broke. Men scrambled toward the ridge, dragging each other by belts and coat collars. Horses found higher footing and pulled away. The remaining rifles were useless after being dropped in water and mud. Thorn stayed on the boulder until the last possible moment, as if leaving first would turn defeat into fact. Nisha stood above the gate on a stone ledge. Clara came out through a side vent and climbed beside him. She was soaked, her palms were torn open. One knee had started to swell from striking stone underground. They watched Thorn wade toward the retreating men. For the first time since arriving in the basin, Clara saw him without an audience he controlled. He looked smaller, not physically, simply less important. The water ran around his legs without caring who he was. By the time the moon dropped behind the western ridge, the Syndicate had abandoned the passage. The basin did not celebrate. There was too much work. The gate still smoked in two places. A section of roof above the tack room had caught an ember. One ranch hand had a bullet crease along his calf. Another had two cracked fingers. Nisha's arm needed cleaning and stitching. Clara reopened the ordinary irrigation lines before she allowed herself to sit. In the kitchen, she heated water and cut Nisha's sleeve away from the wound. "It's shallow," she said, "so you keep saying, because you keep looking at it like it insulted you. It interrupted work. That is insulting." He glanced at her. Clara threaded a needle. "Hold still." Nisha's hand closed around the edge of the table. "You have done this? On horses?" His eyes narrowed. Clara smiled despite herself. "People are easier. They usually understand why you're hurting them. I am reconsidering letting you stay." She laughed. The sound surprised everyone in the kitchen. Even Nisha smiled. When the stitches were finished, Clara wrapped his arm and finally looked at her own hands. The rope burn from Blackwood's rescue had opened again. Mud filled the cracks in her knuckles. Nisha took the basin from her. "Sit." "I am sitting." "Be quiet then." He cleaned her palms with warm water. His hands were enormous around hers, but his touch was careful. He removed grit with the corner of a cloth, dried the skin, and spread pine salve over the worst places. Clara watched his bent head. No one had ever cared for her hands before. People had praised them when they worked fast, criticized them when they failed, called them small, neat, useless, nimble, strange. But no one had treated the damage as something worth tending simply because it belonged to her. She looked away toward the stove. A kettle ticked as it cooled. "Nisha." He tied the bandage. "Yes? Thank you." He turned her hand over once, checking the wrap. "Better than thanks," he said. Clara looked at the gate through the open kitchen door. The work was waiting. She nodded. Near dawn, a fist struck the outer bell post. Every person still awake reached for a weapon. Thomas ran to the slit and looked out. "Riders." "How many?" Nisha asked. 6, maybe 7. "Colors?" Thomas squinted. "Stars." The marshal came through the narrow passage at sunrise. Behind him rode 5 deputies and Ezra Miller, the rancher from the southern flatlands. Miller's bay horse was white with dried sweat. He had clearly ridden hard through the night. Blackwood's note had reached him before midnight. Miller had sent his fastest hand toward the territorial road, then ridden out to guide the marshal into the basin. The law arrived late for the battle, but early enough for the consequences. They found Thorn's men scattered along the lower ridge, wet, bruised, and too tired to invent a single convincing story together. Silas Grissom was easier to locate. Clara led 2 deputies to the maintenance cell. Grissom sat on the floor with his back against the wall. When the stone door opened, he raised one hand against the daylight. The marshal looked inside. "What happened to him?" Clara considered. He entered a restricted maintenance area. One deputy coughed into his fist. Grissom stared murderously at her. The marshal put him in irons. Preston Thorn tried law first. He stood near his half-submerged wagon in a ruined vest, wet trousers tucked into once-polished boots. He demanded to know under whose authority the marshal had entered private syndicate operations. The marshal took Blackwood's signed statement from inside his coat. His. Thorn's face went pale. Blackwood came forward on a crutch Nisha had made from cedar. He looked ill, exhausted and afraid. He spoke anyway. He told the marshal about the false water filings, the sabotage orders, the poisoned grain, the powder, the hired gunmen, and the plan to burn the ranch after breaching the gates. Thorn interrupted 3 times. The marshal silenced him on the 4th. "Mr. Thorn, you can explain your accounting to a judge. These people attacked company representatives." The marshal looked at the ruined ram, the soaked powder, and the bullet marks in the cedar gates. "Looks to me like your representatives brought a siege engine." Thorn's mouth opened. Nothing useful came out. The deputies collected weapons. Grissom was put in the rear of a transport wagon with 2 other men. Thorn was allowed to ride under guard until the marshal saw him try to whisper to one of his scouts. After that, he rode in the wagon too. Before leaving, Blackwood asked Clara for a moment. He had washed, but dried mud still marked the seam of his coat. His injured leg shook each time he shifted weight. He held out his brass telescope. Clara looked at it. I don't need that. I know. Then why? Blackwood lowered his eyes. I spent weeks looking at this place through glass. I saw walls, paths, distances. You saw what things meant. Clara did not answer. He pushed the telescope toward her. Take it. She accepted it. The brass was scratched and dented near the eyepiece. I'm still testifying, he said. This doesn't buy anything. No, I know. He looked toward the acequia entrance. I thought you'd leave me. I thought about it. A weak smile crossed his face. That's fair. Clara tucked the telescope under her arm. Tell the truth when they ask. I will. That will be more useful than apologies. Blackwood nodded. The transport wagons left just after sunrise. Thorne looked back once from behind the iron rail. Clara stood beside the broken gate with a shovel in one hand and Blackwood's telescope in the other. She did not wave. When the last wagon disappeared, the silence that followed felt different from the silences before battle. Not safe. The frontier was never safe, but unoccupied. Their silence again. Miller remained. He took off his hat and walked toward Clara before speaking to Nisha. Months earlier, he had once asked her if she needed a stool to mount a horse. She remembered because he had laughed at his own joke longer than anyone else. Now he stopped in the mud and removed his hat completely. I saw the water come out of the pass from my ridge, he said. Thought the whole mountain had split. Clara waited. I was wrong about you. Yes. Miller blinked. Nisha looked away, perhaps to hide amusement. Miller cleared his throat. I brought 4 men and a wagon of seasoned cedar, if you'll have it. Clara looked toward the gate. The lower hinge was warped. One outer plank had burned through. The drainage run was filled with silt. We'll have it. Miller nodded. Where do you want us? Nisha said nothing. He looked at Clara. The choice was deliberate. Clara felt it. Unload the cedar by the left post, she said. 2 men on silt. 1 to the roof with Tomas. Don't pull the burned plank until we brace the inside, or the hinge will twist. Miller put on his hat. Yes, ma'am. The words landed strangely. Clara watched him walk away. She had not expected respect to sound so ordinary. Repair took 3 days. They began with the water. Clara crawled every major branch of the acequias, checking for cracks caused by the emergency release. At the orchard line, she found 2 shifted stones and a cedar brace that had split along the grain. Nashi could not reach it from the inner run, so he passed her tools one at a time through the access shaft. Wedge. His hand appeared with a wedge, smaller. The wedge disappeared and another replaced it. Resin. A tin came through. Coffee. Silence. Clara waited. A cup appeared. She laughed so hard she nearly spilled it in the tunnel. At the surface, Miller's men rebuilt the damaged gate brace under her direction. None of them asked why the smallest person on the ranch was telling them where to set a 12-foot cedar beam. They had seen the passage after the flood. Proof saved time. On the second afternoon, Clara found a piece of blue silk inside the repaired vent. Most of the ribbon had been buried in mortar and silt, but one frayed end remained caught around the iron brace. She touched it with 2 fingers. Nisha's voice came from outside the access. Problem? No, she considered pulling the ribbon free. Instead, she packed fresh mortar around it and left it where it was. Some things did not need to be preserved by keeping them clean. They were preserved by remaining useful. On the 4th morning, Clara entered the secondary tunnel with a lamp and found a green shoot growing from a pocket of wet silt. She stopped. 2 tiny leaves reached toward a slit of light no wider than a coin. A cottonwood seed must have traveled in with the flood and lodged behind a stone. It should not have grown there. There was hardly any soil, no direct sun, too much rock above it. Clara crouched. She almost moved the seedling to the surface. Then she thought better of it. The place was impossible, but the plant had already begun making use of what it had. Clara collected smooth pebbles from the channel and built a small ring around the sprout so a careless boot or tool would not crush it. When she returned 2 days later, the leaves had opened wider. She told no one about it for a week. Then she brought Nisha. He had to lie on one side at the widest part of the access and look down the tunnel while Clara held the lamp near the plant. He stared at the tiny leaves. How did it get there? Water. It will need light. It has some. Not much. Clara looked at him. Sometimes not much is enough. Nisha's eyes shifted from the plant to her. He said nothing. They left the seedling alone. The legal fight did not disappear with Thorne. It changed shape. For several weeks, papers traveled between the basin, the territorial seat, and the Syndicate's eastern offices. The marshal's report documented armed trespass, poisoning, sabotage, and attempted destruction of property. Blackwood's testimony filled the gaps Thorne had hoped to hide behind company agents. 2 hired men testified in exchange for reduced charges. Most important, the claim of no noose collapsed under records of livestock, orchard yield, ditch maintenance, and the physical fact of an irrigation system older and more continuous than the Syndicate's filing. Nisha hated every minute of the paperwork. Clara did not enjoy it either, but she could endure it. At the kitchen table, she arranged receipts, trading records, tax notes, and letters into piles. "This one proves grain sale," she said. Nisha looked at the faded paper. "It proves I sold grain to a man who cheats at cards. It can prove both," he grunted. She added it to the evidence stack. An old ledger from Nisha's father contained dates of ditch cleaning, written beside moon phases and calf counts. The handwriting changed over the years, but the maintenance record never stopped. Clara copied the dates onto clean sheets. At midnight, Nisha set a cup of coffee beside her. "You should sleep. So should you. I am not doing foolish work with ink. You are hovering over foolish work with ink. That is supervision." Clara smiled and kept writing. The hearing took place in a territorial courthouse that smelled of floor wax, old paper, and the coal smoke trapped in men's coats. Clara disliked the building immediately. Its ceilings were too high, its windows too narrow, and every sound seemed to belong to someone else. Boots clicked on tile, pens scratched behind doors. Clerks carried bundles tied with red string as though the fate of land and water were ordinary laundry. Nisha wore the same clean work shirt he used for funerals and winter trading. He had refused a borrowed coat. "I own one," Miller had told him. "I know it might help. If a coat changes the truth is already in trouble." Clara had hidden a smile. Now they sat at a long table facing Preston Thorne across the room. He looked restored. His hair was trimmed. His vest was clean. No mud remained on his boots. If Clara had met him for the first time there, she might have believed he belonged to the polished machinery of government, more than to the ruined siege camp she remembered. That, she realized, was one of his talents. He knew how to dress violence in respectable clothes. The Syndicate's attorney began with maps. Colored lines showed property boundaries, proposed cattle routes, and water allocations. The basin appeared as a pale rectangle marked with numbers. The acequias did not appear at all. Clara leaned toward Nisha. "They erased the tunnels." "No," he said quietly. "They never saw them." The attorney argued that Nisha's claim lacked modern engineering documentation and that seasonal variation proved inconsistent use. He described the basin as underdeveloped acreage. Clara looked at Nisha when he heard that phrase. His expression did not move. One hand closed around the edge of the bench. When their turn came, Clara carried the old ledger forward. The hearing officer, a tired man with wire spectacles, looked at the oilcloth wrapping. "What is this?" "Maintenance record," Clara said. "How old?" "Entries begin 19 years ago. Some references are older." The syndicate attorney objected to the informal notation. Clara opened the book. "May I explain the symbols?" The officer nodded. She pointed to the circles. Full moon. Summer cleaning was done at night because daytime heat increased loss and made the open channels dangerous to work. She pointed to the leaf marks. Spring runoff. These entries correspond to clearing the intake after snowmelt. Then the calf counts, grain sales, orchard yields, dates of gate repairs. The book was not elegant, but it was stubborn. Year after year it showed water being used, maintained, and protected. Thorne's attorney shifted tactics. "Miss Vance, how long have you personally been employed at the basin?" "Several months." "So you cannot verify entries made before your arrival." "I can verify the structures described in them." "You are not an engineer?" "No." "A surveyor?" "No." "A hydrologist?" "No." The attorney smiled slightly. "Then on what professional basis do you claim expertise?" Clara looked at the maps on his table. "On the basis that I have been inside the system your survey left blank." The room became quiet. The attorney's smile disappeared. Clara continued. "I can tell you which cedar brace was replaced 6 years ago, because the old peg is still seated in the north joint. I can tell you the fourth vent has mineral buildup consistent with long use. I can show you tool marks older than any syndicate filing on the intake stones. And I can tell you that when your client's men blocked the main line, water pressure increased behind a slab they had disturbed because they did not understand the system they were trying to claim." The hearing officer looked at Thorne. Thorne stared at Clara. For once, his expression contained no contempt, only calculation that had arrived too late. Blackwood testified after noon. He entered on a cane, accompanied by a deputy. The room changed when he named the poison. It changed again when he described the powder wagons. The syndicate attorney tried to dismiss him as a criminal seeking leniency. Blackwood agreed. "I am seeking leniency," he said. "That is why I am telling the truth, before somebody offers me a better lie." Even the hearing officer looked up at that. Miller testified to the continuity of ranch operations and to seeing the emergency water release during the siege. Vale, the store clerk, produced notices showing similar syndicate claims against other small ranches. A deputy submitted confiscated correspondence tying payments for hired men to a company account controlled by Thorne. By late afternoon, the syndicate's neat maps seemed less impressive. Paper had finally met evidence it could not flatten. Outside the courthouse, Clara sat on the bottom step and rubbed her aching knee. Nisha came out carrying the ledger under one arm. "How did I do?" she asked. "You talked a lot." She stared at him. He sat beside her. "Good," he added. "Thank you. I prefer tunnels. So do I." A wagon rattled past carrying empty milk cans. Across the street, a woman shook a rug from an upstairs window. For all the importance placed on the hearing, the town continued with its errands. Clara found that comforting. Thorne emerged a few minutes later with his attorney. He stopped when he saw them. For a moment, Clara expected another threat. Instead, Thorne looked at the ledger in Nisha's hands. "You think this ends because a clerk likes your old book?" he said. Nisha did not answer. Clara did. "No, it ends because you tried every method you had, and none of them made the water yours." Thorne's face tightened. "You're very certain for someone who arrived with nothing." Clara considered the words. Then she looked toward Nisha, the ledger, the road home. "I arrived with tools." She stood. That turned out to be enough. Thorne walked away. It was the last time Clara saw him outside custody. The final decision arrived in a plain envelope 6 weeks after the siege. The territorial office recognized the basin's prior and continuous beneficial use and rejected the syndicate's competing claim pending further review of fraudulent filings. Thorne's company could appeal. They did not. By then, Preston Thorne had more urgent problems. Criminal charges, investors asking why company funds had paid armed men, and directors insisting they had never approved any illegal action. Silas Grissom faced charges of assault, sabotage, and attempted arson. Josiah Blackwood received a reduced sentence for cooperation. Clara read the decision twice. Then she carried it to Nisha, who was shoeing a bay gelding near the barn. He read the first page. He turned to the second. Then he folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his shirt. "That's all?" Clara asked. "What else should happen?" "I don't know. I expected you to look pleased." "I am pleased." "You look the same." Nisha picked up the horse's hoof again. "The horse still needs a shoe." Clara laughed. That evening, however, he opened a jar of peaches he had been saving since spring. Clara decided that was celebration. Summer moved toward autumn. The basin changed color by inches. Rabbit brush yellowed along the lower slope. Nights sharpened. The orchard leaves began to dull at the edges. Water in the acequias cooled enough to numb Clara's fingers within minutes. Life became ordinary again, which felt like a luxury. There were calves to doctor, fence posts to replace, grain to stack, harness to oil. A kitchen roof leaked during the first hard rain. Cinder lost a shoe on the north trail. Tomas split his trousers climbing through a fence and tried to repair them with saddle thread until Clara took pity on him. Visitors came more often. Some wanted to see the gates where the syndicate had failed. Others came because the basin had water when lower ranches were already dry. Nisha tolerated the curious as long as they stayed out of the tunnels. People in town stopped using China doll when Clara entered the general store. A few tried to pretend they never had. She preferred the ones who simply looked embarrassed. Miller asked her advice on a drainage problem near his eastern pasture. She rode out, studied the grade, and told him his men had cut the ditch too straight. He frowned. Straight is shorter. Water doesn't care what's shorter. It cares what's lower. They rebuilt the line with a gentler fall. It worked. Miller paid her in cash and a sack of coffee, better than anything stocked at the basin. Nisha inspected the beans. Good work. You mean the ditch? The coffee. Clara threw a dishcloth at him. One cool afternoon, Nisha placed a folded document on the kitchen table. Clara was trimming dried chilies into a bowl. What is it? Read. She wiped her fingers and opened it. It was a partnership deed, not employment papers, not a temporary wage agreement. The document recognized Clara Vance as a legal partner in the ranch operation and granted her an undivided interest in the improved acreage, structures, and waterworks of the basin. She read the first paragraph again, then the second. Her throat tightened. Why? Nisha leaned against the wall. Because it is true. That isn't a legal reason. It should be. Nisha. He came to the table. You maintain the water. You rebuilt the gates. You kept records that saved the claim. You know every inner vent now better than I do. I work here. You built here. She stared at the signature line. The memory of her father's farm came back unexpectedly. A sheriff at the edge of a field, her mother packing dishes into a crate, her father standing with empty hands after laying down the shovel. Paper had once meant removal. Now paper was being used to say she could not be removed easily. Her eyes burned. She hated that. Nisha pretended not to notice. There is ink, he said, pointing to the small tin. Clara laughed under her breath. You prepared a speech, didn't you? No, you had one. I did not. You sound disappointed I ruined it. Sign the paper. She did. Her handwriting looked tiny beneath the formal text, but steady. Nisha did not take the pen. He pressed his thumb into the ink and placed a dark print beside her name. Clara looked at the two marks, her narrow signature, his broad thumbprint. Neither covered the other. Partner? She asked. Nisha nodded. Partner. She held out her hand. He looked at it. What? I believe civilized business people shake hands. We have spent months proving civilized business people are dangerous. Fair point. He took her hand anyway. His grip was gentle. By the time the first frost touched the high grass, travelers had begun using a new name for the passage. Clara heard it at the trading post when two teamsters argued over directions. You take Clara's gate, one said. Not the lower wash. Lower wash'll eat an axle. She turned from the flour barrel. The clerk noticed. You didn't know? Know what? That's what folks call it now. Why? He stared at her. Clara knew it was a foolish question as soon as she asked. The clerk shrugged. Names happen. She rode home annoyed. Nisha was split cedar behind the barn. They renamed the passage. He drove them all into a log. Yes, you knew. Yes, you didn't tell me. No, why? The log split cleanly. Nisha looked at her. You would have complained. I am complaining now. Yes. Clara put both hands on her hips. He almost smiled. That evening she walked to the cedar gates with a small iron chisel. The timber still carried dark scars from the siege. One plank was newer than the rest. The iron hinge bore hammer marks from the repair. Clara chose a place on the inner face at her own eye level. She did not carve her name. Instead, she carved a simple symbol based on the acequia plan, a circle for the reservoir, straight lines for the main channels, smaller branches for the vents. It took an hour. Wood shavings gathered near her boots. When she finished, she rubbed cedar dust from the grooves with her thumb. Nisha stood halfway up the ridge watching. What is that? He called. A warning to whom? Anyone who thinks the gate is the important part. Nisha came down and examined the carving. He traced one line. You left out the west overflow. Clara stared at him. It's a symbol, not a survey. It is inaccurate. She shoved the chisel into her belt. Then carve your own. Nisha's low laugh followed her all the way back to the house. A week later, before sunrise, Clara climbed the basin rim. Frost silvered the sage. Her breath showed pale in the air below. Mist hovered over the irrigated fields while the dry country beyond the passage remained brown and hard. She could hear the acequias even from the ridge if she concentrated, not the actual water underground. Perhaps, but the sounds connected to it, a trough filling, a gate creaking near the orchard, hooves moving across damp soil. The basin was alive because water reached the places it needed to reach. Nisha came up behind her carrying an iron wrench and a bundle of cedar stakes. He stopped at her side. The fourth vent is running high, Clara said. I know. How? You complained about it in your sleep. She looked at him in horror. I did not. You said quarter turn 3 times. Clara covered her face with one hand. Nisha looked toward the valley. Could be worse. How? You could dream about paperwork. She laughed. They stood together as sunlight reached the upper wall. Nisha's shadow stretched long across the ridge. Clara's looked narrow beside it. For most of her life, people had used shadows that way, as evidence. Bigger meant stronger, taller meant more capable, loud meant certain, money meant right. The basin had cured her of that arithmetic. Nisha had strength she would never possess. He could lift a gate beam she could barely roll. He could move stone that would pin her to the earth. Clara could enter places his shoulders could not cross. She could hear changes in a vent before a surface ditch went dry. She could read a ledger, remember a wagon track, repair a binding with one arm inside a wall. Neither skill made the other smaller. That had been the lesson Thorne never understood. He had looked at the ranch and seen a resource guarded by one giant man and one tiny woman. He had failed to see a system, stone supporting cedar, water supporting grass, knowledge supporting labor. One person covering the space another could not. Knight set the cedar stakes on the ground. You ready? For what? The fourth vent. Clara groaned. I was enjoying the view. The water does not care. Stone is difficult to lie to. Water has no manners. You make the basin sound charming. It kept you. The words were simple. They stopped her. Clara looked down into the valley. Home had always been described to her as a place a person belonged before they did anything to earn it. A family house, a birthright, a town that knew your name. She had lost those versions early. The basin had offered something harder and, to her, more honest. A place at a table because she worked there, trust because she proved trustworthy, a share of the land because she helped preserve it. People who expected her to remain tomorrow. She rubbed her thumb over the callus at the base of her palm. Kept you too, she said. Nisha looked at her. Then he nodded. They started down. Near the gate, the cedar symbol Clara had carved caught the new sun. Beyond it, the passage opened toward the dry country, where wagons and lawyers and men with polished boots would continue to come and go. The outside world had not become kinder because Preston Thorne lost. There would be other claims, other droughts, other winters. A ranch did not become secure simply because one enemy rode away in irons. But the water was moving. The gates were standing. The fourth vent needed adjustment. There was coffee in the kitchen and a loose shoe on cinder and a broken hinge on the north grain bin. Ordinary problems. Clara had once imagined safety as the absence of problems. Now she understood it differently. Safety was having work worth doing and someone beside you who trusted you to do your share. At the lower path, Nisha handed her the wrench. It was heavy. Clara took it with both hands. You know this is nearly as tall as I am. It is not. It feels like it. You want a smaller one? She adjusted her grip. No. Nisha's mouth tilted. Together they crossed the yard toward the acequia entrance. The sun climbed over the rim, warming the wet cedar, the stone, and the frost-dark soil. Water moved unseen beneath their boots, steady and patient, carrying the life of the basin through narrow places no one looking from a distance would ever notice. Clara noticed. That was enough.